Did you guys make some good memories on Thursday? I think Christmas time is the best because there is no other time in the year that is more conducive to making memories that last a lifetime. And I think that Christmases of the past are most often what we kind of think of if we're asked to ponder what we would say is the good old days. What are the good old days for you? Because I think regardless of your age, regardless of how old you are, there's going to be a time in your past that you look back on fondly, that you look back on with bright eyes, and that you think about as the good old days. It's a good memory that lasts a lifetime. And I think a lot of the time it revolves around Christmas. It happens around this time of year. And for me, I'm brought back to this moment. So I have a brother, and first of all, the fantastic photographer of these pictures is actually in attendance this morning. These both are taken by my mother, and this picture on the left, as a quick aside, I can't stop being in disbelief of how perfect of a picture it is, with the exception of my goofy head sticking up from above my brother's head in the background. But this is from 2006, these pictures. And this was the year that the Wii came out, the Nintendo Wii, the iconic game console. And my brother, I know that he didn't intend to rip the packaging that way, but he tore it so that just the Wii logo is visible, and then he turned it as if it's like an advertisement to my mom. It's just incredible. And to make matters even better, the only people in this room who know my brother, being my parents and me, can attest to the fact that he is one of the most stoic individuals alive. He is so reserved and quiet and opposite of me, personality-wise, but that face is not artificial. That face was not made up. That is exactly how he reacted. And then on this right picture is us opening two amazing remote-controlled airplanes, but it's also kind of a perfect image of what an older sibling and a younger sibling look like, because on the older sibling is giving this perfectly cute photogenic smile, and then the younger sibling is doing whatever it is that younger siblings do with their face when they're having their picture taken. That is, I'm not proud of that face, but we'll take it, we'll take it. And by the way, that plane didn't see the sunset that evening because it took off maybe twice. And the second time that airplane took off with the remote control in my hand, it did a fabulous nosedive and made a landing from which it could not take off again. So, amazing, amazing memories. But that is what I consider to be kind of the good old days. And looking back on these memories and thinking about the good old days kind of reminds me of this quote that I really, really like. And it says, "I wish there was a way to know that you're in the good old days before you've actually left them." Someone should write a song about that. This quote was written by a man named Greg Daniels, and it was written for the actor Ed Helms to read as the character Andy Bernard on the show The Office. And the reason this quote is so profound to me is because for a show that relies so heavily on discomfort and humor, finding a quote this meaningful is such a startling, pleasant surprise because it carries a lot of really deep meaning. Because the unfortunate reality of these memories, as pleasant and as warm as they may be, is that we have to deal with the fact that they don't last forever. And Andy Bernard was very much the fact that these moments in our lives that are so good and we know that we're going to look back with warm eyes on, they don't last forever. Andy's quote is a human response to a worldly reality. And that worldly reality is something that we are all too familiar with. And it's simply that nothing lasts forever. That's the reality that's being conveyed with Andy's quote, and that's the reality that we have to deal with, especially around this time of year, where another Christmas has gone by, it's December 28th, and we've made new memories, but now we're looking back on them. Now we're looking back on them. Or maybe for you, this reality has hit you particularly hard because there are certain moments in our lives where the truth that nothing lasts forever hits us like a ton of bricks. I think maybe you're my age or a little bit younger, like you're just getting started in your career or you're in college, and as your life continues to get busier, and as you continue to get busier, as you continue to grow, the magic that Christmas used to hold kind of starts to wind down. And there might be one particular year in that life where that reality hits you harder than it ever has before. For me personally, it was my first year in seminary. In order to go to seminary, you have to move away from where you previously lived and go to either St. Louis or Fort Wayne, Indiana. And so my first year in seminary, on Christmas Day, I woke up alone, having lived my entire life spending Christmas previously with my family. And to make matters even worse, on that day, I had to go into work. So I had to work on Christmas, waking up alone with no family there in St. Louis. God bless the restaurant industry. Yes, yes. But in that moment, that reality hit me harder than it ever had before. You could be spending the first Christmas without a loved one. And not just like separated by distance like I was from my family. You could have lost a loved one. And previously, you spent every Christmas with this loved one, and it was almost assumed that they would be there on Christmas Day. But this year was the first year that you had to realize that there weren't going to be any more Christmases where they will be in attendance. That reality that nothing, not even the life of your loved ones, lasts forever is hitting you harder than it ever has before in that very moment as you realize that your loved one isn't there anymore. Or maybe this reality has nothing to do with Christmas at all. Maybe this worldly reality that nothing lasts forever is trying to creep its way into your faith, into your life at church. Because I'm sure that there's some of you sitting here today who see what's up here, that nothing lasts forever, and you know where I'm going with this sermon already. You already know where I'm going. There's a worldly reality that says nothing lasts forever. And we just read from Isaiah that God is going to give us something that does last forever. And you're sitting there and you know that. And then you're thinking to yourself, well, if I'm coming to church and I'm supposed to be receiving that one thing that does really last forever, why do I not feel anything when I go to church anymore? If you're talking about looking back on the good old days with warm memories, I'm looking back on the times when I would go to church and I would feel full of the Spirit. And everything made sense. And I felt like God was with me. And if that's supposed to last forever, why does that not feel like that anymore when I'm coming to church? Because it used to be like every church service I went to felt like Christmas Eve here at St. Mark. It was just gorgeous, beautiful, everything was going right, and it felt like nothing could stop me. But now, it's different. Maybe nothing, not even my faith, lasts forever. Maybe that's the reality for you. And if you're one of those people sitting there knowing where I'm going with this sermon, good on you, because that's exactly where I'm going with this sermon. We just read from Isaiah, and Isaiah opens our eyes not to a worldly reality, but he opens our eyes to God's heavenly reality. And that is that the kingdom of heaven, the kingdom that Jesus came down to establish when he was incarnate by the Virgin Mary and made man, that kingdom lasts forever. And I think that's exactly right, and I think it's something that we can all pick up on because it's just so clearly communicated by the scriptures. But the problem arises when we try and derive implications from that message. What does that actually mean for a 21st century Christian that God's kingdom lasts forever? What does that mean for us now? And what did it mean for Isaiah's audience back then? Well, I think one thing that it means is that this kingdom that God established gives us gifts. It gives us gifts, not just things that we receive when we die and go to be with Jesus, even though there's plenty there. It gives us tangible gifts here and now. Pastor Matt was mentioning it earlier. We have gifts that we can experience, that we can feel, that we can see, that we can hear. The fact that you can gather in church on Christmas Eve with your family and enjoy the beauty of Christmas, enjoy the amazing moments that every one of us gets to experience, that's a gift. The fact that you can come to church at all is a gift. The fact that you can be here sitting next to people who share your faith, who can help you grow and support you, is a gift. And even beyond church, those moments that you get to sit on Christmas Day where you get to see your child beaming with joy and excitement, that's a gift. God's kingdom gives us gifts. And those gifts are good things. But they are worldly things. They are things that we get to experience here and now. They're a part of the world, and they're gifts, and they're good, but they also don't last forever. And that's where the problem arises. Because I think since we can feel these gifts, since they're right here in front of us and we can sense them, we have the sinful tendency to take those gifts and replace the giver of the gifts with the gift itself. And that's where the problem arises. Because the giver of the gift is somebody who is not of this world. He's part of that heavenly kingdom that lasts forever. But the gifts themselves, we can see them, we can sense them, we can take pictures of them. And when those things go away, we think that the giver of the gifts themselves is going away. And perhaps no gift is idolized like that more than the mountaintop experience. A little earlier, I mentioned that there might be some of you sitting here thinking about your experience going to church previously, thinking about how when you used to go to church, it felt like you were going to church at a place that looks like this. That's a real place, by the way. That's not AI. That's in North Carolina. It's called the Pretty Place Chapel, and I think it's actually owned by the YMCA. That's totally a real place, and I would love to go to church there. Are you kidding me? That's insane. But there are some days where week in and week out, it feels like you're going to church like this, and it's just amazing. Everything is clicking, everything makes sense, and everything is going right, and it feels like nothing can stop you in your relationship with God. But then sometimes it feels like when you go to church, it looks like that. And you think about that, and it hurts, and it's frustrating, and it might be even worse when you open up about it, and you're vulnerable to one of your friends, and you say, man, I am just struggling. I don't get it. I feel like I'm hearing the same sermon every week, and it's frustrating, and nothing new is making sense to me. And you tell that to your friend, and your friend might respond by saying that that's an indication that your faith is declining. Your friend might say, with good intentions, that might be an indication or evidence that your relationship with God isn't as good as it once was when you were going to church up on the mountaintop. Here's the thing. Mountaintop experiences are gifts. And spiritual ruts are gifts. That's a gift too. You know why? Because at one point you're going to be faced with one of your friends who is also in a spiritual rut, and you'll get to come alongside them and tell you, I've been there. And more importantly, you'll get to share the gospel with them. You'll get to share the truth with them, because the truth is not that this is an indication that your faith is suffering or that your relationship with God is suffering. That is an indication that God is giving you a gift. And just like any other gift that God gives us, a mountaintop experience is a gift that doesn't last forever. That is a gift, thanks be to God, that does not last forever. But it's so easy to confuse that with the giver of the gift itself. But it's just a gift. So we recognize it as such. And if we do recognize it as a gift, we can know who's giving us those gifts. It can reorient our vision and appreciate both the gift and the giver in their proper place. So the kingdom of heaven gives us gifts. The kingdom of heaven also gives us hope. The worldly reality that nothing lasts forever is exhausting. And the more you live, the more you become acquainted with that earthly reality, because the longer you live, the more things you lose, the more things go away. The longer you live, the more loved ones you lose. The longer you live, the more you see things in your life deteriorate. The more gifts you see fall away. The more things just don't last forever. And you become more aware of that reality the older you get, and it becomes exhausting. And Isaiah was writing to an exhausted audience as well. We read in Isaiah that he was talking to a group of people who is exhausted from the history of their kingdom that is no longer the case. They were exhausted by the fact that at one point, their kingdom was great. They knew about King David and all of the good things that he did. They knew about King Solomon and all of the riches that he brought to Israel. They knew about those people, but they also knew that those guys weren't the king anymore. They knew that Israel at one point was the most powerful kingdom in the world, and every other nation looked to Israel for food, for comfort, for peace, for military presence. They all looked to Israel, but those days are the good old days. And Isaiah's audience is dealing with that exhaustion, because those days are far from now. They are over. Because now Israel is shrinking, and there are nations all around them. Syria, Assyria, Babylon, Egypt, all have more power than Israel, and they are surrounding them. And all they have is a memory of what their kingdom was like under King David. And Isaiah has to approach that audience, and he has to give them a message. And the interesting thing about the message that we read, that a child is born, it is structured very similarly to what a birth announcement from the royal palace in Israel would look like. So when a new member of the royal family in Israel was born, the birth announcement had a very specific structure. And when they would release it to the press in Israel, it would look just like that. And Isaiah purposefully structured that verses 6 and 7, in that way, to look like a birth announcement. But Isaiah was also intentional about reminding them that he's not from the royal palace. He's a prophet. So the king that Isaiah is talking about is not going to sit on a throne in the royal palace. He's saying, you can have hope because this king that's coming is not going to fade away like David did. He's not going to be temporal like Solomon. He's going to last forever because his kingdom is not like any kingdom you have experienced. And that's a good thing. And you can have hope in that even though you can't see it. You can have hope in it. I know you're exhausted. And Isaiah is telling you today as well, I know you're exhausted, but you can have hope in something that is going to last forever. It's not going to fade away, and it's going to stand in complete opposition to that earthly reality that nothing lasts forever. You can have hope in that kingdom that will last forever. So this kingdom gives us hope. And the last thing that we learn from this reality of Isaiah's teaching us is that the kingdom it's growing. God's not done with this kingdom. We read in verse 7 that of the increase of his government and of peace, there will be no end. That's what we see in verse 7. That his government is increasing and his kingdom is not going to have any end. It's an indication that God's not done growing his kingdom. And so we naturally raise the question, if the Son of God came down from heaven and was incarnate by the Virgin Mary and became man and lived a perfect life, he fulfilled the law, he was crucified under Pontius Pilate, and on that cross he said the words, "It is finished." Then he died and rose again and ascended into heaven. If all of that happened, he declared it is finished, why is there still sin? Why is there still suffering? Why do I still cry? Why do we still lose our loved ones? And the answer that Isaiah gives is almost frustratingly simple. God's not done. That's it. Even though Jesus lived, fulfilled the law, forgives your sins, died, rose again, and ascended into heaven, God's still not done. He's still not done. And while that response from Isaiah may be frustrating, I would encourage you to look at it from a different perspective. I would encourage you to look at it from your perspective. Because in the very same way that God's not done building his kingdom, God's not done with you. Because if you're that person who finds themselves in a spiritual rut, where every Sunday you show up to church and it feels like you're just struggling. Man, I don't know where I am. I don't know what's going on with my faith. God's not done with you. If you look in the mirror and all you see looking back at you is the sins that you have committed, and you are convinced that that is anything that everyone sees when they look at you, God's not done with you. And if you feel like you're buried under your sins and you can't possibly dig yourself out from this addiction that you've been struggling with, fear not, because God's not done with you. If you don't know what next step to take in your faith, God's not done with you. If you are afraid of sharing the gospel with somebody who lives across the street from you, even though you see them struggling, God's not done with you. If you think church is just something that you do on Sundays, God's not done with you. If you are stuck at home, whether that be for medical reasons or because of your age, and you are struggling to find purpose in what you have left to do in this life, God is still not done with you. And if you are looking back on the good old days and you are just completely convinced that there is nothing that lies ahead of you that will be better or even match up to the good old days of your past because you just don't think that's even a possibility, I'm here to tell you the very same thing that Isaiah told the people of Israel 700 years ago. God's not done with you. He's not done with you. And while that may be an uncomfortable truth on the surface, I would encourage you to continue to think about it from your perspective. God has a relationship with you, and everything that's going on in your life is a gift from him, and he's using it because he's not done with you. That's the reality. That's the truth that God's kingdom lasts forever. In the Gospel of John, Jesus told us and reassured us that he is going to prepare a place for us. That place that Jesus is preparing is our home. That place that Jesus is preparing is that kingdom that is growing. And as we wrap up this series about coming home, that's what we have to look forward to. That's the thing that gives us gifts. That's the thing that we have hope in. And that's the thing through which God is continuing to work with you and not be done with you. So let's use those gifts to remember that God is the giver of those gifts, and we can use those gifts to indicate when we are truly living in the good old days before we've actually left them. Because when Jesus comes back and brings us home, the good old days will be a thing of the past. Amen.